Last week, we looked at how Hester Prynne and her daughter Pearl were depicted as not just human beings, but as symbols in the novel The Scarlet Letter. In this week's readings, the focus of the narrative shifts away from Hester and over to Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale and the relationship that he has with the physician, or leech, Roger Chillingworth. Doctors were often called leeches back in the time period where this story is set, because one frequent method of healing patients was to apply leeches to their bodies, in the belief that they would suck out all of the bad or infected blood. And this was a practice in medicine for thousands of years, and it's actually still even used today for certain specific treatments. Because leeches have properties in their mouths that heal and clean infections or wounds, things like that. Anyway, so we met Roger Chillingworth back in chapters 3 and 4 of the novel, and after his private interview with Hester, we learned that he is in fact Hester's long-lost husband. He's suffered shipwreck and then capture by Indians further south along the coast, and he's just now arrived back in Boston as Hester is undergoing her public penance. So that must have been quite the surprise for him. He's thinking, hey, I'm home after this long journey, I'm going to get to see my wife again, and then literally one of the first things that he sees is her standing up on the scaffold with somebody else's child undergoing penance for adultery. So though we might expect him to be angry or to feel vengeful toward Hester, he's not. Rather, he blames himself. He essentially says, listen, I knew that you were too young to be happy with me in marriage, but I went ahead and persuaded you to marry me anyway, and then I left you alone, where you would be subject to temptations that would be too powerful for you to resist. So really, this is all my fault. I should have been smarter than this, I should have been wiser than this, and I put us both in a bad position. So he's an incredibly self-reflective and intelligent man, and not unkind either, at least not in the beginning. But he doesn't want Hester to reveal his identity to the townspeople. Roger Chillingworth is obviously a pseudonym, but that's what he wants to go by from now on. I don't think we ever learn his actual name, aside from the fact that it was probably something Prynne, right? Because Hester Prynne. So he's determined to find out who Hester committed adultery with. And from his words, we get the impression that he's going to be much less forgiving towards that man, whoever Pearl's father is, than he is toward Hester. And over the course of these chapters, even, like I said, he's kind in the beginning, we see a moral degradation or a moral degeneration take place in Chillingworth. And it's reflected in his external appearance. At one point, Hester hardly recognizes him as the man that she is married, or that she had married, because his thoughts and his schemes have rendered him hideous on the outside as well as on the inside. Now, whether this might actually happen, I guess, is up for debate. Certainly, in real life, there are very, very wicked people who maintain innocent-looking countenances. And even in other literature, like in Billy Budd, for example, we saw that someone like John Claggart, the Master-at-Arms, he nursed envy and hatred toward Billy, while all the while keeping up a dignified, noble exterior. But we see that in Hawthorne, the internal world of the mind, of the conscience, tends to bleed out into the external world. The barrier that separates those two realms is much less strong in Hawthorne than in some other writers, or maybe than it is in real life. And we'll come back to that point in a minute. But to say a few more things about Chillingworth, he undertakes to psychologically torment the man who he's discovered is Pearl's father, Arthur Dimmesdale. So under the guise of acting as his physician, under the pretense of healing him, Chillingworth does his best to wear the minister down, to exaggerate his guilt and his fear of being discovered. And this goes on for years, with the minister completely unaware of what's happening. He thinks that Chillingworth is his friend and that he's there to cure him, but really Chillingworth is acting as this tormenting, accusing devil or demon that's always lurking, trying trying to trap him into confessing. And now we need to talk about Arthur Dimmesdale, because the further that the novel progresses, the more it starts to look like this might be a tale more about him than even a tale about Hester Prynne. He has the more complicated plot and the more tangled dilemma to resolve. Hester's conflict is outward and relatively straightforward. It's about herself versus society. Dimmesdale's is about the conflict he has with his own self. It's about the struggle he has with the guilt that he feels for keeping silent about his sin, and the ways in which he attempts to punish himself in order to expunge the sin on his own. I think that in order to understand what's going on here, or what he's going through, it's important to note one thing right off the bat. He is a true believer. We might be inclined to dislike him, since he's apparently so morally weak that he lets Hester take the fall for the sin that they've both committed, and because he's made himself into a hypocrite by continuing to allow the townspeople to admire and revere him, even though he's fallen. But we can't believe that his piety is only an act. He does believe in God, and it's for that very reason that he feels such agony for what he's done. If this was all an act, he wouldn't feel any remorse at all. And we read this in chapter 9, where Hawthorne says, Mr. Dimmesdale was a true priest, a true religionist, with a reverential sentiment largely developed, and an order of mind that impelled itself powerfully along the track of a creed, and wore its passage continually deeper with the lapse of time. In no state of society would he have been what is called a man of liberal views. It would always be essential to his peace to feel the pressure of a faith about him, supporting while it confined him within its iron framework. So, he's built his life around the gospel, around the Christian creed, and it guides him just as surely as it restricts him. And now everything within him is telling him that he's guilty of an unconfessed sin, and nothing he does can make his conscience clean. We read about some of the things that he tries to do: long fasts, night-long vigils where he forsakes sleep. And the more he attempts to punish himself in this way, the more his parishioners think that he's holy and good. Because they say, oh, look at that noble, humble minister there. If he acts this way over whatever paltry sins he must be committing, how should we be acting? Because they see Dimmesdale as this kind of holier than thou, maybe not holier than thou, that implies that he's self-righteous. They see him as the opposite of that, as this man that's already got one foot in paradise, to put it that way, maybe. And this just adds to Dimmesdale's torment, that everybody sees him like this. He even scourges himself with the whip, though he's careful to hide the evidence of this. And I think that these attempts to purge his sin with self-punishment is an interesting way of avoiding the punishment that he knows would actually be the just one, publicly confessing what he's done. And I think maybe we all do this to an extent. So if we've committed a sin or done something wrong and it's on our conscience, we immediately look for a way to try to make it right with God, sometimes in a way that isn't in any way connected with the actual wrong that we did. Maybe we're short-tempered or mean to a family member or to a friend, and so next Sunday we put extra money in the offering plate and hope that that settles the score in God's eyes. When what we really should have done was apologize to that family member or friend. But who wants to do that, right? No one wants to confess to wrongdoing or admit fault. It's much easier to try to bargain our way out of it with God. And I think that's what Dimmesdale's trying to do here, and it's what he's failing to do. We get the most telling instance of this in chapter 12. Dimmesdale can't sleep, and so he wanders down to the marketplace and mounts up onto the very same scaffold that Hester had to stand on all of those years ago. And it's like he's trying to share in the punishment that was inflicted on Hester, as if by doing that, his conscience will be cleansed. But there's a big difference between when Hester was on the scaffold and when he is now on the scaffold. We read, "But the town was all asleep. There was no peril of discovery. The minister might stand there, if it so pleased him, until morning should redden in the east, without other risk than that the dank and chill night air would creep into his frame, and stiffen his joints with rheumatism, and clog his throat with catarrh and cough, thereby defrauding the expectant audience of tomorrow's prayer and sermon. No eye could see him save that ever wakeful one which had seen him in his closet, wielding the bloody scourge. Why, then, had he come hither? Was it but the mockery of penitence? A mockery indeed, but in which his soul trifled with itself. A mockery at which angels blushed and wept, while fiends rejoiced, with jeering laughter. He had been driven hither by the impulse of that remorse which dogged him everywhere, and whose own sister and closely linked companion was that cowardice which invariably drew him back, with her tremulous grip, just when the other impulse had hurried him to the very verge of a disclosure. Poor, miserable man." So, he knows, even in the act of committing this penance, that it's not really going to cleanse his conscience, it's not really going to make the sin good. His soul is trifling with itself, the text says, which is really a miserable place to be in. And while he's standing on the scaffold, going through all of this, Hester and Pearl show up. They've been out late on other business, and they mount up onto the scaffold too, and for the first time in the story, the family is all brought together. And Dimmesdale gets a kind of peace from this. But Pearl, of course, because she's Pearl and she's going to say what she's thinking, she recognizes the hypocrisy of the situation. She asks Dimmesdale, "Hey, would you acknowledge me in broad daylight with people watching like the way that you're doing now?" And Dimmesdale, he's honest, he says, "No, I can't do that. I won't be able to acknowledge you like this if I see you in the street tomorrow or the next day. I'm only going to be able to acknowledge you openly on Judgment Day." Hester, for her part, sees the frayed, unhealthy state that Dimmesdale is in and decides that she needs to intervene on his behalf. So she's going to try to talk to Chillingworth and get him to relent. But we can imagine how well that's going to turn out. And while this scene is going on, a meteor shoots through the sky. And this is a good example of how Hawthorne blends the internal and the external, so that we, the reader, aren't quite sure of what exactly happened in reality or of what happened in someone's imagination. Remember that he did the same thing in Young Goodman Brown. We were left to decide for ourselves whether supernatural events did in fact occur, or whether it was all in Goodman Brown's head. So here, the meteor takes on the appearance to Dimmesdale of a scarlet letter, of an A in the sky. But Hawthorne is very careful to make sure that the narrator expresses doubt as to whether this really happened or not. And in the end, we're left with either one of two scenarios. So either God is blazoning the sky with the symbol of Dimmesdale's hidden sin, which is kind of cool, because it's like, you can hide your sin and punish yourself in your closet all you want, but all of creation is going to trumpet it abroad until you do something. Or the other scenario is that Dimmesdale's become so obsessed with this guilt and with this sin. It's this one topic that it's all he thinks about, and so he's seen his guilt in the heavens themselves. I'm not going to read the whole passage because it's lengthy, but midway through chapter 12, we read about how nothing was more common in those days than to interpret all meteoric appearances and other natural phenomenon that occurred with less regularity than the rise and set of sun and moon, and so many revelations from a supernatural source. So he's saying basically that, yeah, back in those days, anytime something happened in the sky that was noteworthy, there must be something supernatural connected to it. And he gives some examples of this in the passage. Pestilence is prefigured by a meteor shower. A blazing spear or a shooting star prefigures Indian warfare. Things like that. But then we read, "But what shall we say when an individual discovers a revelation addressed to himself alone on the same vast sheet of record? In such a case it could only be the symptom of a highly disordered mental state, when a man, rendered morbidly self-contemplative by long, intense, and secret pain, has extended his egotism over the whole expanse of nature until the firmament itself should appear no more than a fitting page for his soul's history and fate. We impute it, therefore, solely to the disease in his own eye and heart, that the minister, looking upward to the zenith, beheld there the appearance of an immense letter, the letter A, marked out in lines of dull red light. Not but the meteor may have shown itself at that point, burning duskily through a veil of cloud, but with no such shape as his guilty imagination gave it, or, at least, with so little definitiveness that another's guilt might have seen another symbol in it." So, because the external world of reality and the internal world of Dimmesdale's conscience are so blended here, the narrator has to actually step in with a tone of neutrality and reinterpret things that may be happening in Dimmesdale's imagination in light of external reality. Otherwise, his guilty conscience runs away with the narrative altogether. And so Hawthorne's really clever about doing this, and watch for it in the concluding chapters that you're going to read for next time. On that note, for next time, finish up the Scarlet Letter. We'll see how all of this ends, and then we will wrap up our discussion of the novel then. Thanks.